Marcus Reed sat in that cold plastic chair outside the glass office, his hands trembling slightly as he straightened his one good tie for the third time, the same tie he had worn to his wife's funeral 2 years ago, and as he looked down at his worn shoes and his slightly too small suit jacket that he had bought from a thrift store 3 days ago using the last $40 he had saved from selling his watch, he whispered quietly to himself the same thing he had whispered to his 7-year-old daughter Sophie that morning when he dropped her off at school. Today is the day everything changes, baby girl. But what Marcus did not know, what he could not have possibly imagined in that moment, was that today was indeed going to change everything, just not in the way he had planned, because in exactly 45 minutes, he would walk out of this building a broken man, and in exactly 46 minutes, one of the most powerful men in the entire country would come running after him, down the street, and the reason why would leave the entire world in tears. My name is Marcus Reed, and I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I was not always the man sitting in that plastic chair with holes in his socks and a lunch packed in a paper bag because I could not afford a proper lunchbox. No, there was a time not so long ago when I had a good job as a structural engineer at a mid-sized firm in Detroit, Michigan, where my wife Elena and I had built what I believed was a beautiful life. A small house on Maple Street with a yard, big enough for Sophie to run around in, a dog named Biscuit who ate too much and slept on our feet every night, and a future that felt solid and real and full of light. And then in the space of 8 months, everything collapsed because first the firm I worked for lost its biggest contract and laid off 30% of its workforce, including me. And then 3 months later, Elena went to the doctor for what we thought was a routine checkup and came home with a diagnosis that rearranged every single atom of our existence, stage 3 pancreatic cancer. And what followed was a blur of hospitals and insurance forms and phone calls and tears and Sophie sitting on the kitchen floor asking me questions I did not know how to answer. And I held it together. I held it together as tightly as I have ever held anything in my life, because I had to, because Sophie needed me to. And when Elena passed on a Tuesday morning in March with the sun coming through the hospital window and her hand in mine, I made her a promise that I have never forgotten, not for a single day. I promised her that I would take care of Sophie, that I would give her the life she deserved, that I would be enough for both of us. And it is that promise that brought me here, to this plastic chair, to this building, to this moment. The job posting had been for a structural engineering position at Harlow Infrastructure, one of the fastest-growing construction and development companies in the state of Ohio, and I had applied 3 months ago with a cover letter I rewrote 14 times and a resume I had polished so carefully that my friend David, who worked in HR at a local company, told me it was the best resume he had ever seen. And when I got the call 2 weeks later telling me I had been selected for an in-person interview, Sophie and I had celebrated with ice cream at the kitchen table, the cheap kind from the gas station, but it tasted like the most expensive thing in the world that night. And she had looked at me with those enormous brown eyes that are exactly like her mother's and said, "Daddy, you're going to get it, I know you are." And I had believed her, because children that age carry a kind of certainty that adults spend their whole lives trying to recover. And I had held on to her certainty, like a life raft for the entire 2 weeks leading up to this interview, practicing my answers in the bathroom mirror every morning, reading about Harlow Infrastructure until I knew their project history better than some of their own employees probably did. And now here I was, sitting in this chair, waiting, and I was ready. I truly believed I was ready. The receptionist, a young woman named Priya with kind eyes and a warm smile, had told me that Mr. Harrison, the head of the engineering division who would be conducting the interview, was running about 10 minutes late, and so I sat there in the lobby of the 42nd floor of the Harlow Tower in downtown Columbus, Ohio, and I looked out at the city below and I thought about Sophie and the way she had hugged me that morning, wrapping her small arms around my neck so tightly that it almost hurt, and she had said, "Come home happy, Daddy." And I had said, "I will, I promise." And the weight of that promise was sitting on my chest right there in that lobby, and I breathed through it the way I had learned to breathe through hard things, slowly, from the bottom of my lungs, and I told myself that I was qualified for this job, that I had the experience and the knowledge and the hunger for it, that the panel of interviewers on the other side of that glass door were going to see exactly what I had to offer, and that by tonight I would be calling my mother in Pittsburgh to tell her the news, and she would cry the way she always cries when good things happen, and it would be one of the best phone calls of my life. And then a man who I would later learn was named Greg Harrison walked out through the glass door, and he was the kind of man who fills a room even when the room is already full, tall and broad-shouldered with silver hair, and an expression that suggested he had made a great many decisions and regretted very few of them. and he shook my hand firmly and looked me in the eye and said, "Marcus Reed, good to meet you, come on back." And I followed him through the glass door and into a conference room, where two other people were already seated, a woman named Jennifer from HR and a younger man named Carl who was apparently the current lead engineer on Harlow's biggest active project. And I sat down across from them and I straightened my tie one more time and I smiled the smile I had been practicing, the confident but not arrogant one, the one that said I am serious about this and I am ready for it. And Greg Harrison opened a folder on the table in front of him and looked at my resume and said, "Impressive background, Mr. Reed, let's get started." For the first 20 minutes it went well, it went better than well, because I knew this material the way I knew the layout of my own apartment. And when Greg asked me about load-bearing calculations and project management under tight deadlines and how I had handled a particular structural challenge on a bridge project I had worked on in 2019, I answered clearly and thoroughly, and I could see Carl nodding slightly as I spoke, the way engineers nod when they hear something that is technically correct and well explained, and Jennifer was writing things down, which I had been told by David was a good sign, and I was beginning to feel something that I had not felt in a very long time, which was hope, real concrete hope, the kind that has weight and substance to it. And I was thinking about Sophie, about how I would pick her up from school today and tell her the news, about how we would get the good ice cream this time, the real kind from the actual ice cream shop 2 blocks from our apartment, and she would ask for sprinkles and I would say yes to the sprinkles, and then everything shifted. Greg Harrison set down his pen and leaned back in his chair and looked at me in a way that was different from how he had been looking at me before, more searching, more deliberate, and he said, "Marcus, I want to ask you something a little outside the standard interview questions, if that's all right." And I said, "Of course, because what else do you say?" And he said, "I've looked at your resume carefully and I noticed there's a gap here, about 8 months between your last position at Hendrix Engineering and today, and I'm also noticing that your last position ended about 2 years ago, so we're actually looking at a 2-year gap in employment. Can you walk me through that?" And I had known this question was coming. I had prepared for this question. I had an answer for this question. But sitting there in that room with those 3 faces looking at me, something happened that I had not prepared for, which was that the answer I had rehearsed, the professional, composed, forward-looking answer about personal circumstances and skills maintenance and freelance consulting work I had done here and there, that answer felt suddenly hollow and dishonest, not because it was untrue exactly, but because it was not the truth, not the real truth, and the real truth was sitting inside me like a stone, and it was heavy, and I was tired, so tired of carrying it with a smile. And so I told them the truth. I told them about Elena, not everything, not the worst of it, but enough. I told them that my wife had been diagnosed with a serious illness and that I had made the decision to be her primary caregiver during her treatment, and that after she passed I had spent some time getting my daughter and myself stable before returning to the job search. And I told it plainly and without drama, the way I had learned to speak about hard things. And when I finished there was a brief silence in the room, and Jennifer had stopped writing and Greg Harrison was looking at me with an expression I could not quite read. And then he cleared his throat and said, "I appreciate you sharing that, Marcus, and I'm very sorry for your loss." And it was the right thing to say, and he said it the right way, but there was something in the air after that, some subtle shift in the temperature of the room, and I felt it the way you feel a change in the weather before it happens, in your bones, in your chest. And the interview continued for another 15 minutes, but something had changed. Something had closed, and I recognized the closing the way you recognize the end of a song you know well. When Greg Harrison shook my hand at the end and said, "We'll be in touch, Marcus, we have a few more candidates to see this week," I nodded and said thank you, and I meant it genuinely. I was grateful for the opportunity. But as I walked back through the glass door and past Priya at the reception desk, who gave me that same warm smile, I knew, the way you sometimes just know things, that I was not going to be getting a call from Harlow Infrastructure. And the knowing of it settled over me like a cold rain, and I pressed the button for the elevator, and I stood there looking at the floor numbers counting down, and I thought about Sophie saying, "Come home happy, Daddy." And I felt the particular specific pain of a promise you are not going to be able to keep. The elevator ride down 42 floors felt like it lasted 100 years. Just me and a woman in a blue blazer who was looking at her phone, and I stood there watching the numbers go down, and I was doing the thing I always do when things go wrong, which is making calculations, running through the math of our situation, how many weeks of groceries we had left in the budget, how many more months before the next round of bills came due, whether the freelance consulting work I had been picking up through a small online platform would be enough to bridge the gap, whether I needed to call my mother and ask her for money again, which I hated doing more than almost anything because she was retired and on a fixed income, and the last time I had called she had sent me $200 and cried on the phone, and I had cried too after we hung up, standing in the kitchen while Sophie slept, crying quietly into a dish towel so she would not hear me, and the elevator reached the lobby and the doors opened and I walked out into the marble atrium of the Harlow Tower and I pushed through the revolving glass door and I walked out onto the street. It was a cold November day in Columbus, the kind of cold that has teeth in it, and I had not worn a coat because I only owned one decent winter coat and it was slightly too informal for a job interview, and I had made the calculation that it was better to look professional and be cold than to look casual and be warm. And so I stood there on the sidewalk in my interview suit feeling the wind cut through it, and I looked up at the gray sky and I thought, okay, what do we do now? Because that is the only question that ever matters, not why did this happen or what does this mean or is this fair? Just what do we do now? And I started walking toward the parking garage 3 blocks away where I had parked the 2009 Honda Civic that made a sound like a tired old dog whenever I turned the ignition but had never actually left me stranded. And I was about 1.5 blocks away from the Harlow Tower when I heard someone behind me, not just walking, but running, the sound of dress shoes on, pavement moving fast, and a voice called out, "Mr. Reed, Marcus Reed, wait please." And I stopped and turned around, and there, running toward me down the sidewalk of 5th Street in Columbus, Ohio on a cold November afternoon, was a man I had never seen before, not Greg Harrison, not anyone from my interview, but a man in an extraordinarily well-tailored dark suit with silver cufflinks and no tie and an expression of such focused urgency that the people around him on the sidewalk were stepping out of his way without knowing exactly why, and he reached me slightly out of breath and looked at me with eyes that were dark and sharp and completely serious, and he said, "I'm Daniel Harlow, I own this company, and I need you to come back inside with me right now. And I want you to pause here for just one moment because I need you to understand what it feels like to hear those words when you are the person I was in that moment. When you are a man who has just walked out of an interview he believes he failed, who has $43 in his bank account and a 7-year-old daughter at home and a dead wife whose memory he carries like a second skeleton inside his own bones, when you have been holding yourself together through sheer force of will for 2 years and you are very, very tired, and a man you have never met, the owner of the company you just interviewed at, comes running after you down the street and tells you he needs you to come back inside. What does that feel like? It feels like the world has tilted slightly on its axis, like the ground under your feet is no longer completely reliable, like something is happening that you do not have a category for. And I looked at this man, Daniel Harlow, and I thought I should be cautious. I thought I should be measured, but instead what came out of my mouth was a very simple okay. And he nodded once and said, "Good, come with me," and we walked back toward the tower together. And I had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. Daniel Harlow, I would come to learn over the next few hours and then the next few weeks and then the next several years, was not the kind of billionaire you see on television, the loud, flashy kind who names things after themselves and gives interviews about disrupting industries. He was something else entirely, quieter and more deliberate, a man who had built his company from a small construction outfit he had started with his brother at age 24 into one of the largest infrastructure development companies in the Midwest, and he was known in the industry for 2 things specifically: the quality of his projects and the loyalty of his people, and his employees had an average tenure of 11 years, which in the construction industry was almost unheard of. And the reason for both of these things, I would come to understand, was that Daniel Harlow paid very close attention to people, not to their resumes or their credentials, though those mattered, but to something harder to quantify, something he had once described in an interview as the specific gravity of a person, which he defined as how much they actually weighed in the world, how much their presence mattered, how much of themselves they brought to what they did. And on this particular Tuesday morning in November, Daniel Harlow had been walking through the 42nd floor of his own building on the way to a meeting when he had stopped in the hallway outside the conference room where my interview was happening, not to eavesdrop but simply because he was passing by, and he had heard something through the glass that had made him stop walking. He had heard my voice, answering a question about my 2-year employment gap, telling the truth about Elena, and he had stood there in the hallway of his own building listening to a stranger tell a story about love and loss and keeping promises, and something in it had reached through the glass and the professionalism and the architecture of the interview process and grabbed him somewhere deep. And when the interview ended and he saw me walk past through the glass door and press the elevator button, he had made a decision quickly, the way he always made decisions, which was by trusting the part of himself that responded before his reasoning mind could complicate it. And he had walked quickly to Greg Harrison's office and said, "The last candidate, Marcus Reed, don't let that file go anywhere." And Greg had said, "We were actually leaning toward not moving forward." And Daniel had said, "I know, I heard the conversation, but I want to talk to him myself." And Greg had said, "He's already left." And Daniel had said, "How long ago?" And Greg had checked his watch and said, "Maybe 2 minutes." And Daniel Harlow, who was 53 years old and ran a $4 billion company, and had not literally run anywhere in at least a decade, had gone out through the lobby and through the revolving door and down the street after me. We went back up to the 42nd floor in the elevator, and this time Daniel Harlow was in the elevator with me, and the energy was entirely different from the first ride up. And he did not make small talk. He was not the small talk kind. He just stood there with his arms crossed and his eyes straight ahead. And once we got to the floor, he led me not to the conference room where the interview had taken place, but to a corner office at the end of the hallway that looked out over the city in 2 directions, floor-to-ceiling windows, a desk that was large but not ostentatious, bookshelves along one wall filled with actual books that looked actually read. And he gestured to a chair across from his desk and sat down himself and looked at me directly and said, "Tell me about your wife." And I did not expect that. I had not prepared for that, and something about the directness of it, the complete absence of professional artifice in it, made something in my throat tighten. And I said, "What, specifically, would you like to know?" And he said, "Whatever you want to tell me." And there was a silence, and I looked out the window at the gray Columbus sky, and I thought about Elena. I thought about her laugh, which was too loud for a woman her size, about how she made terrible coffee and refused to acknowledge it, about how she used to read Sophie bedtime stories using different voices for every character. And I looked back at Daniel Harlow and I said, "She was the most capable person I've ever known." And that was how it started, the conversation that lasted not 15 minutes like an interview but 2.5 hours, because Daniel Harlow did not want to know about my project management skills or my familiarity with structural load calculations, at least not then, not first. He wanted to know about me, the actual me, the human architecture underneath the professional one. And I told him things I had not said aloud to anyone except my mother, about how hard it had been to watch Elena get sicker, about how I had tried to shield Sophie from the worst of it, but children know more than you realize, about the night Sophie had come to me after Elena's second round of chemotherapy and said, "Daddy, is Mommy going to die?" And I had sat with that question for what felt like a very long time before saying, "Mommy is very sick and the doctors are trying their very best to help her get better." Which was true but also not the whole truth, and how that half-truth had sat in my chest ever since like a splinter I could not quite reach, and about the night after the funeral when Sophie had climbed into my bed at 2 in the morning and put her small hand on my face in the dark and said, "I can hear you crying, Daddy." And I had said, "I'm okay, sweetheart, go back to sleep." And she had said, "You don't have to be okay." And she was 7 years old, 7, and somehow she already understood something that takes most adults a lifetime to learn. Daniel Harlow listened to all of this without interrupting, without the kind of sympathetic head tilting that people do when they are performing empathy rather than actually feeling it. He just listened with those dark, sharp eyes and occasionally asked a question that showed he had heard exactly what I said and was thinking about it carefully. And at one point he said, "What did you promise her?" And I said, "Who?" And he said, "Your wife, when she was dying, what did you promise her?" And I looked at him for a moment and I said, "I promised her I would take care of Sophie, that I would be enough for both of us." And he nodded slowly and said, "And how's that going?" And it was such a direct question, such an honest question, that I almost laughed, and I said, "Some days better than others." And he said, "Yeah." And there was something in that "yeah," just that single syllable, that told me Daniel Harlow was not a stranger to grief. And I did not ask him then, but I would find out later that his younger brother, the one he had started the company with, had died in a work site accident 12 years ago, and that this loss had shaped Daniel in ways both visible and invisible, and that it was at least partly why the safety record at Harlow Infrastructure was not just good but legendary, because Daniel had turned his grief into a standard, had decided that no other family would lose someone on one of his projects if he could help it, and that decision had cost him money and time and had slowed certain projects down, and some investors had pushed back, and he had told them, politely but absolutely, that this was not negotiable. At the end of the 2.5 hours, Daniel Harlow leaned forward in his chair and put his forearms on his desk and said, "I want to offer you a position at Harlow Infrastructure, Marcus." And I said, "What position?" And he said, "Senior Structural Engineer on our River Bend Development Project, which is our largest active project, a 12-month timeline, good salary, full benefits from day one." And he named a salary that was higher than anything I had made before, significantly higher. And I looked at him and I said, "Why?" Not because I was being ungrateful, but because I genuinely needed to understand. And he said, "Because I've been in this business for almost 30 years and I've hired hundreds of engineers. and I can tell you from experience that the skills on your resume are real and impressive, and that's part of it. But the bigger part is what I heard in that conference room today, which is that you're someone who shows up, who tells the truth when it's hard, who keeps his promises, and I need people like that more than I need anything else. And I looked at him for a long moment and I said, I'm not going to disappoint you. And he said, I know that. And he said it without hesitation, and the certainty of it broke something open in me, something that had been tightly sealed for 2 years, and I pressed my lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then I looked back at him and I said, Thank you, and my voice was not quite steady, and he said, Don't thank me yet, the River Bend project is genuinely difficult and Greg Harrison is going to work you hard. And I said, Good. And I meant it. I sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I started the car, just sitting there in the Honda Civic with my hands on the steering wheel and the engine off, because I needed to feel what had just happened before I drove anywhere. I needed to let it be real, and what kept going through my mind was Elena. I kept thinking, Elena, you should have seen that, you should have been there for that, and the sadness and the gratitude were completely tangled together the way they always are in moments of joy when you have lost someone, because joy after loss never comes clean. It always comes mixed with the grief of the person who isn't there to share it. And I sat there and I cried for about 10 minutes, not the quiet dish towel crying but real crying, the kind that comes from somewhere below your sternum. And then I stopped and I wiped my face and I looked at my phone and I saw that it was 2:47 p.m. and Sophie got out of school at 3:15 and I needed to go get her, and I started the car and it made its tired dog sound, and I pulled out of the parking garage into the gray November afternoon, and I drove to Sophie's school with the heat on full blast and the radio off. She came out of the school doors in her red coat and her backpack that was almost as big as she was, and she saw me standing by the car and she ran. The way children run when they are happy to see someone, with their whole body, and she hit me like a small freight train, and I picked her up and held her tight, and she pulled back to look at my face and said, Daddy, your eyes are red. And I said, I know. And she said, Did you cry? And I said, Yes. And she said, Good crying or bad crying? Because this was a distinction she had developed herself at around age 6. The idea that there were different kinds, and I said, Good crying, baby? And her face broke into the biggest smile and she said, You got it. And I said, I got it? And she screamed. Right there in the school pickup lane, a full-volume 7-year-old scream of pure joy, and 2 other parents looked over and I laughed. The first Rayal laugh I had laughed in a very long time. And I buckled her into her booster seat and I drove us to the ice cream shop 2 blocks from our apartment, and she got sprinkles. She got all the sprinkles. That night after Sophie was asleep, I called my mother. And she cried the way I knew she would. That gentle, relieved crying of a parent who has been watching their child struggle and is finally seeing a door open, and she said, Elena would be so proud of you. And I said, I know, Mom. And I meant it. I did know that, and after I hung up I sat on the kitchen floor the way I sometimes do when I need to think, my back against the cabinets and my knees up, and I thought about the strangeness of the day, about how I had walked into that building believing one thing and walked out believing something entirely different, not just about my circumstances but about the world, about the possibility that sometimes people are paying attention, that sometimes the things you carry quietly do not go unnoticed, that sometimes someone is standing in a hallway and they hear something true and they decide to do something about it. I started at Harlow Infrastructure on the first Monday of December, and the work was exactly what Daniel had said it would be, genuinely difficult. The River Bend development was a massive mixed-use project along the Scioto River involving residential towers, commercial space, and a public park, and the structural challenges were significant, particularly around the riverbank stabilization, and Greg Harrison was indeed exacting, the kind of boss who reviews your calculations twice and asks questions that reveal he understood your methodology completely and found the one place where it could be tightened. And I loved it. I loved the difficulty of it, because for 2 years I had been underemployed and underutilized, and I had not realized how hungry I was for a hard problem until I had one in front of me again. And the work became the thing that organized my days. I would drop Sophie at school, go to the office, work with full focus for 8 or 9 hours, pick Sophie up, make dinner, help with homework, bedtime routine, and then sometimes go back to my laptop for a couple more hours, not because anyone required it but because I was genuinely engaged in a way I had forgotten I could be. And my colleagues noticed. They are the kind of people who notice these things. Engineers are observers by profession, and within a few weeks I had found a real place in the team. But here is the thing about starting over when you have been through what I had been through. The external circumstances can change very quickly, but the internal ones do not. And there were still nights when the weight of everything pressed down very hard, when Sophie had a bad dream and woke up crying for her mother, and I sat on the edge of her bed at 3 in the morning rubbing her back and saying her mother's name with her, just saying it together in the dark. Elena, Elena, we miss you. Elena. And there were mornings when I drove to work with a kind of hollow feeling that had nothing to do with work at all but was just grief, plain and ordinary grief, doing what grief does, which is show up without warning and demand acknowledgement. And I learned over those months at Harlow to hold both things at once, the gratitude and the sadness, the forward motion and the backward glance, because you cannot actually choose between them. They are both real and they both deserve to exist. And pretending otherwise just makes you less honest, less whole, less able to be what Sophie needed me to be, which was real. 3 months into the job, Daniel Harlow stopped by the River Bend site on one of his regular visits, which he made roughly once a month, and I had seen him once or twice before on these visits, but we had not spoken at length. And on this occasion he found me at my temporary site desk reviewing a set of revised foundation drawings, and he pulled up a folding chair and sat down next to me and looked at the drawings and asked a technically precise question about the pile spacing that I answered. And we talked engineering for about 15 minutes, real technical conversation, the kind I had not had at that level since my days at Hendrix, and at the end of it he looked at me and said, "How are you settling in?" And I said, "Really well, this project is exactly the kind of challenge I needed." And he nodded and said, "And how's your daughter?" And I said, "She's good. She made a friend at school named Lily whose mother is also single and they have become inseparable, which has been great." And something shifted in his face when I said that, something small but visible, and he said, "Good, that's good," and stood up and said, "Keep the work up," and walked off toward the next part of the site, and I watched him go and thought, there is more to this man than what is visible, which is a thought I have about very few people, but about him I thought it immediately and never stopped thinking it. The thing about Daniel Harlow that I came to understand slowly over the months and then years I worked for him was that his relationship to the company he had built was not primarily financial. Of course the financial piece mattered. He was not naive about that. But the company was something else for him at its core. It was the living continuation of the thing he and his brother had started together. It was his way of honoring Marcus, who had died at 31 in a trench collapse at a job site in the suburbs of Cleveland, and every safety protocol, every above-code standard, every time Daniel insisted on slowing a project down rather than cutting a corner, was an act of love for a brother he had lost too young. And when I finally understood this, maybe 8 or 9 months into my time at the company, it recontextualized everything, including the moment in the hallway when he had stopped to listen to a stranger talking about grief through a glass wall, because of course he had stopped, of course he had recognized something, because he was carrying the same weight, just in a different shape. Sophie turned 8 in February, a few months after I started the job, and we had a real birthday party that year for the first time since Elena got sick, 7 kids from her class at our apartment with streamers and a real cake that I had baked myself from a recipe I found online, and it came out only slightly lopsided, which Sophie said made it more interesting, and she blew out the candles and I took photographs, and she wore a paper crown all afternoon, and she was just so happy. Straightforwardly uncomplicated happy. And that evening after everyone went home and she was in the bath and I was sitting on the bathroom floor leaning against the wall the way I always do during bath time to supervise and talk, she said to me, very casually, the way children say things that hit like a piano falling from a building, "Daddy, I think Mommy was at my party today." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "I felt her, like a warm feeling. Do you know what I mean?" And I said, "Yes, I know exactly what you mean." And she said, "Good," and went back to playing with her rubber duck, completely satisfied, 7 going on 80, and I sat there on the bathroom floor thinking about Elena and thinking about the specific mercy of children, how they have access to a kind of truth that adults have usually managed to complicate out of themselves. By summer, the River Bend project was at its most intense phase. The structural work was hitting a particularly challenging section where the riverbank geology was not quite what the preliminary surveys had suggested. And there was a 3-week period where my team and I worked very long days redesigning the foundation approach for the North Residential Tower. And I was in early and out late, and Sophie was at day camp during the day and being watched by my neighbor Mrs. Okafor in the evenings, and I missed her in that specific way you miss your child when work takes you away from them for stretches. The missing is both about them and about yourself, about the person you want to be for them. And one evening when I finally got home at 8:30, she was already asleep, and I went into her room and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her sleeping and thought about the promise I had made to Elena, about being enough for both of them, and I thought that the promise was not a single act but 1,000 small acts and 1,000 more after that, and that I was in the middle of those acts, in the complicated, unglamorous middle of them, and that was okay. That was actually exactly where I was supposed to be. The River Bend project finished on schedule in November, exactly 12 months after I started at Harlow, and it was an unusually emotional completion for me personally because the timeline had a certain symmetry to it. A year ago I had been walking out of a failed interview, and now I was standing at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a project that bore in part the stamp of my engineering, my calculations, my solutions to problems that had resisted easier solutions, and Daniel Harlow was there. At the ribbon cutting, and he gave a short speech, and at the end of it he said something that I did not expect. He said, "Every building we make carries the lives of the people who made it, not just their labor but their stories, and this building has some good ones." And he did not look at me when he said it, but I felt it anyway, the way you feel something that is meant for you even when it is not said directly. And afterward at the reception, my colleague Nadia, who had become a real friend over the year, said to me, "He meant you, you know." And I said, "I know." And she said, "He told me once that you were one of the best hires he'd made in a decade." And I said, "He told you that?" And she said, "Daniel doesn't compliment people to their face because he thinks it makes them stop working hard, but he tells their colleagues so it gets back to them. You didn't know that." And I laughed and said I did not know that, and she shook her head and said, "This whole company is completely bizarre and I love it." After the River Bend project, I was promoted to lead engineer and put in charge of a new project, a pedestrian bridge over the Olentangy River that was going to be part of a larger urban connectivity initiative for the city of Columbus. And this project had a particular meaning for me because bridges have always been the thing in structural engineering that I love most, not because they are glamorous, though some of them are, but because of what they do, the simple, relentless purpose of them. They connect things that would otherwise be separated. They make possible the crossing of distances that without them would be barriers. And I poured myself into this project with everything I had, and Sophie came to the site one afternoon with me, just to see it, and she stood at the edge of the construction area with a hard hat that was many sizes too big and looked at the emerging structure over the water and said, "You're making that, Daddy?" And I said, "Me and my team, yeah." And she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "That's the coolest thing I've ever seen." And I thought, Elena, she is so much like you. She just says exactly what she thinks. No editing, no hedging, just the truth. The bridge opened 15 months after that first day in the construction area with Sophie, and it was a public event. The mayor was there was a small crowd, local media, and I walked across it during the opening with Sophie holding my hand. And when we reached the middle point and stopped and looked out at the river from the place I had designed, from the structure I had calculated into existence, I felt something that I have tried to describe to many people and have never quite gotten. Right, it was not pride exactly, or not only pride, it was something more like completion, like a specific kind of wholeness that comes from making something real out of something that existed first only as numbers and intentions and the particular grammar of structural engineering. And Sophie squeezed my hand and said, "Daddy, we're standing on something you made." And I said, "We are." And she said, "That means part of you is in this bridge forever." And I said, "Yeah, it does." And she thought about it for a moment and then said, "I think Mommy helped." And I said, "I think so too. I need to tell you about a conversation I had with Daniel Harlow about 2 years into my time at the company, because it is important, because it explains something that I want you to understand about what I learned from all of this and from him specifically. And the conversation happened in his office late one evening when everyone else had gone home and I had stopped in to drop off some documents that needed his signature, and he was still at his desk and he gestured for me to sit down, and we ended up talking for an hour and a half, and at one point I told him what I just told you about standing on the bridge with Sophie, about the sense of completion, and he listened carefully and then he said, "You know what I've noticed about you since you started here?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "You work like someone who knows that work is not the point." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "The engineers I've had over the years who burn out or get bitter or lose their creativity, they're usually the ones for whom the work is everything, and when the work goes badly or the recognition doesn't come or the project hits a wall, they have nothing to absorb the blow with. But you work incredibly hard, I've seen it, but there's always something behind it that the work is pointing toward, and that thing doesn't change when the work gets difficult, and that's what makes the work sustainable." And I thought about that for a long time, and I thought he was right, that the thing behind the work for me was always Sophie, and before that Elena and Sophie together, the specific people I was responsible to and for, and that this responsibility was not a burden but an orientation, a direction giver, a reason that preceded and survived any individual success or failure. 4 years after I started at Harlow Infrastructure, Daniel came to me with a new proposal. He wanted me to lead the development of a community infrastructure program. A new initiative Harlow was launching to work with underserved communities around Ohio on public infrastructure projects, parks and community centers, and safe pedestrian infrastructure in neighborhoods that had been neglected by municipal investment for decades, and it would mean stepping back from the purely technical engineering work and taking on a broader leadership role that included community engagement and advocacy. And I said yes without needing to think about it, because this was exactly the kind of work that connected what I knew how to do with why I had wanted to do it in the first place. And the program grew over the next 3 years into something that we were both proud of, that the communities it served were genuinely impacted by real parks where before there had been vacant lots, safe crossings where children had been endangered, community gathering spaces where there had been nothing. And I would sometimes think about the cold morning when I walked out of a job interview I had failed and feel the distance between that moment and this one, not just in terms of circumstance but in terms of who I had become in the interval and what that becoming had required. Sophie is 11 now, nearly 12, and she is, in case you are wondering, exactly the person you would expect her to be given who her parents are. She is loud and certain and intensely empathetic, and she reads constantly, and she wants to be a marine biologist because she watched a documentary about octopuses and declared them to be, in her exact words, the most interesting thing on Earth, possibly in the universe. And she plays soccer badly but enthusiastically, and she still sleeps with the stuffed rabbit that Elena gave her when she was 3, and she keeps a photograph of her mother on her bedside table and says goodnight to it every night. And she asked me a few months ago, very directly because she is always direct, whether I was ever going to get married again, and I said I didn't know, that I was open to the future, and she said, "Good, because I think I'd be okay with it, I just want you to be happy, Daddy." And she said it the way children say things that are simple, because they have not yet learned to make them complicated. And I thought, Elena, you would be so proud, you would be absolutely undone by this child. What I want to tell you now, near the end of this story, is what I believe the story is actually about, because I have had a long time to think about it, and I think it is about several things that are true simultaneously and do not cancel each other out. It is about showing up even when you don't feel ready, about telling the truth even when the professional version of events would be easier to say, about the fact that grief and purpose are not opposites, that you can be broken and still be effective, that you can be sad and still keep your promises, that what you carry does not disqualify you from what you are reaching for. It is also about paying attention, about what it means to actually see other people. Daniel Harlow standing in that hallway and listening to a stranger talk about his wife was a small act. It took 30 seconds, but it was the kind of attention that most of us are too busy or too armored to offer, and the willingness to act on what he heard, to run down a street after a man he had never met because something true had moved him. That willingness is a kind of courage that has nothing to do with bravery in the traditional sense but everything to do with being alive in the fullest way you can manage. I think often about that Tuesday morning in November, about the cold and the gray sky and the $43 in my bank account and the Honda Civic making its tired dog sound. And I think about the person I was when I walked into that building and the person I was when I walked out, and they were the same person. That is the important thing. I did not become someone different. I did not suddenly acquire qualities I had not previously possessed. Everything that Daniel Harlow responded to in that hallway was already there, in that plastic chair, in the thrift store suit, in the hands checking the knot of the funeral tie, the capacity for honesty and commitment and love, and the specific stubborn persistence that grief teaches when you let it teach you something instead of just letting it hollow you out. And I think that is what I most want to say, because there are people listening to this who are sitting in their own plastic chairs, metaphorically or literally, who are holding themselves together with something close to the last of what they have, who are looking at their own gray November sky and calculating the math of their situation and finding that the numbers are very tight. And I want to say to those people, what you carry is not a weakness. The story of how you have survived to this point is not a liability. The truth of who you are and what you have been through is not something to manage strategically. It is the most real thing about you, and there are people in the world, not enough of them but some of them, who can hear truth when it is spoken and who will run down a street after it. And you cannot know in advance who those people are, which means the only reasonable strategy is to keep showing up, keep telling the truth, keep making the calculations and then getting in the car and driving to the next place, and to remember always that the promise you made to the people who love you is not a burden you are trying to bear. It is a direction you are lucky to have. Elena, if there is any version of existence in which you can hear this, I kept the promise, I am keeping it still. Sophie is magnificent, and I wish every day that you were here to see it, but since you are not, I am doing the next best thing, which is seeing it for both of us, the way you asked me to, the way I promised I would, on a Tuesday morning in March with the sun coming through the window and your hand in mine. And if you are still here watching this story, if it moved you in any way, if it reminded you of someone you love or a promise you have made or a moment when someone saw you and chose to act on what they saw, then please take 1 second to like this video and subscribe to this channel, because every story like this one starts with someone willing to listen, and you being here means you are that kind of person, and that matters more than you know.